Ok. Bom, boa tarde a todas e todos aqui presentes e também para quem está assistindo essa apresentação, essas duas apresentações hoje pelo canal do YouTube aqui do Instituto de Geociências da Universidade de São Paulo. Eu gostaria então de apresentar o nosso primeiro convidado, palestrante, o Dr. Semken, da Universidade do Arizona, Universidade Estadual do Arizona, que está vindo nos visitar, tanto ele quanto o professor Angel Garcia, por meio do projeto da FAPESP, intitulado Geoconservação e Educação Baseada no Lugar. O professor Semken, ele tem uma atividade profissional de longa data, desde 1989. Ele faz parte, né, da Universidade do Arizona. Ele é formado pelo MIT, nos Estados Unidos, nas Ciências da Terra e Planetária, em 1980. Ele fez o seu mestrado na Universidade da Califórnia, em Los Angeles, com Geoquímica. E depois ele voltou para fazer o doutorado no MIT em 1889, com o estudo de materiais cerâmicos. Então, ele trabalha com a geologia, com educação em geociências, trabalha com etnogeologia, trabalha com as comunidades indígenas do Arizona, e vai trazer um pouco, então, da experiência dele aqui para a gente, falando sobre educação baseada no lugar, e também com as comunidades tradicionais, que tem feito vários trabalhos, né, junto às geociências e aos saberes também tradicionais dos diferentes povos indígenas do Arizona. Bom, Dr. Semken, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bachi. I'm very grateful to be here. I first of all say good afternoon, and I apologize that I cannot speak Portuguese. I speak some Spanish, but not well enough that I could make the transition. But I understand that all of you, your English is far better than my Portuguese, so that should be good. And I'm certainly very grateful to my colleagues Denise and Carlos for the relationship we've had for many years in Arizona as well as Brazil, and really grateful to be here and to be able to speak with you today about place-based education and interpretation in geoconservation and geoheritage. So do I have something to advance the slides or just say next slide? Is there a controller I can use?
No, I can.
Okay, so I'll just say next slide here. So, before I begin, I want to acknowledge that the university in which I work, Arizona State University, in the deserts of southwestern United States, is located on the Salt River Valley on the ancestral territories of the Acamela, Otham, and Pipash indigenous people, who are the original and rightful protectors and caretakers of these lands. The map on the lower left there, that shows all of the indigenous homelands in the southwestern United States, and the logo in the center is where our university is located. So you see there are many tribes that call that land home, and they're all still there. They're still very much there. So I acknowledge my responsibility to help sustain these lands. I acknowledge my responsibility to support indigenous students and communities, and I advocate for the ethical incorporation of indigenous knowledge into our scientific field, as well as indigenous research methodologies. I also gratefully acknowledge that I am a visitor to the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples of Brazil, and I respect and honor their relationship to their lands in similar fashion. So I'm going to talk about geoconservation and geoheritage, and it's probably true that most, if not all of you, already know what that is. They're familiar with it. But I wanted to maybe remind us with several definitions. So geoconservation is what we do to recognize, protect, and manage geological heritage, or geoheritage for short. And that has various meanings. The Geological Society of America says that geoheritage refers to sites or areas of geologic features with significant scientific, educational, cultural, and or aesthetic value. So they're geologic sites, but you can see they have many meanings besides just the geology. Jose Brilha, a wonderful Portuguese geoconservation expert, probably one of the best in the world, the way he puts it is special occurrences of minerals, rocks, fossils, soils, landforms, and geologically active processes with exceptional value. And then The International Union of Geological Sciences, the IUGS, which has taken a great lead in promoting geoparks and geoheritage around the world, the way they say is it is a key place with geological elements and/or processes of international scientific relevance used as a reference and/or with a substantial contribution to the development of geological sciences through history. And you'll notice I highlighted the word place. That's very important here. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to show you a lot of pictures from my home country. Okay, so I'm in Arizona, so we have Grand Canyon. That's in our backyard. This is where I do a lot of my work. I bring my students there several times a year. I have been there hundreds of times, and I study and I do work there, so I love it very much. And place, the International Union of Geological Sciences calls geoheritage sites places. So what is a place? Next slide, please. Okay, so a place is not just a location. A place is a location that human beings think is meaningful. It is a place that gains meanings, different meanings, through human interaction with those places. And they can be there for real, they can be there in person, they can be imaginary places, they can be virtual places, they can be places like Mars where we've never set foot, but it's still a place because we give it meaning. And in the case of Grand Canyon, there are many different meanings that are affixed to that place. So there's the great beauty of Grand Canyon first and foremost that everybody pretty much agrees on when they go there. But it is also homeland to 12 indigenous tribes since time immemorial, since long before anybody else was there, it was indigenous homeland. But then later came explorers and settlers who left their own history. It is scientifically important. It is also recreationally important, educationally important, and artistically important. All kinds of artworks are made because they're inspired by the Grand Canyon. And also I wanted to point out in the upper right, many people know the Grand Canyon only from movies or television or virtual reality. So they're also virtual experiences, but they're still important and they still help to make it a place. They attach meaning to that place. Next slide, please. So I like to think of places as the cultural equivalent of landforms. Places, they populate what we would refer to as a cultural landscape. Human beings have established places on the physical landscape, and that physical landscape interpenetrates the cultural landscape. So they interact and they interpenetrate. And two quotes there. The first one is by a great geographer at the University of California from the early 20th century named Carl Sauer. And he said, landscape may be defined as an area made up of a distinct association of forms, both physical and cultural. So landscape is not just natural. Landscape is also human. We are part of it. And that's what that second quote says. That second quote is from an author named Leslie Marmon Silko, who is an indigenous writer from the state of New Mexico in the United States. And she says, viewers are as much a part of the landscape as the boulders that they stand on. So they're both saying the same thing, that you can't have a landscape without human beings. We're part of it. We're interacting with that. And that's what these two maps show. The map on the left is an indigenous map. This is a Navajo map. I spent 15 years teaching and working on the Navajo Nation, the largest indigenous nation in the United States. And that is a map of their traditional homeland. You can see there are 4 mountains in different colors. The upper right is white, then blue, then yellow, then black. Those are the traditional boundaries. Those mountains are the traditional boundaries of their landscape. So that's their cultural landscape. Over here is a tourist cultural landscape of Arizona. So it shows the deserts, it shows the rocks and the cactus, but it also shows the roads and the towns and the places that people have put there. So it shows this, this interpenetration between the natural and the cultural. Next slide, please. But place is really important, and I have been studying this idea of place in geology for my whole career. I got interested. Actually, what got me interested was when I was teaching on the Navajo Nation with indigenous people. They taught me how important it was to be aware of place and to think of place, and that's what really started my whole research career. So I'm very interested in how place interacts with how we understand the earth, how we teach about the earth, how we explore the earth. Okay, so it's related. And that's kind of what I want to say here, is that place is inseparable from research and education in the natural and social sciences. You cannot do research in the natural sciences without referring to place. Why is that? Well, for one thing, we study and teach about nature in and by means of places. As soon as we go out in the field and we start to study an outcrop, we have made it a place. We have a fixed meaning. Even maybe it was already a place, somebody else was already there and gave it meanings, but even if that was not so, when you start to study it, you give meaning to that place and it becomes a place. And if you're interested in the study of place, I would refer you to a man named Edward Casey. Edward Casey is a philosopher. He's at the University of Stony Brook in New York in the United States, but he's a great expert on place. And was one of the highlights of my life. I got to spend an hour talking with him some years ago, and I talked to him about what I did and what he did, and he gave me that wonderful quote. He said, "Our access to space and time is how they happen in a given place." So he's basically saying we can't be scientists without place. That's part of it. And scientific knowledge is a meaning. Scientific knowledge becomes part of the meaning. When we study a place scientifically, we add meaning to that place, and it becomes part of that place. And in some cases, it was for science alone or primarily that we did them. So there's a place on the moon right now called Tranquility Base, right? And 55 years ago, a craft landed on the moon, and they left that plaque behind called Tranquility Base. And that became a meaning. So we made a place on the moon, which remains a place. And so scientific knowledge is part of that. But also our relationship to place influences how we experience them, which means that our relationship to the natural world through place influences how we do geology. Right? Geology is influenced by our relationship to place. Next slide, please. So, and I want to point out that geoscience, because it is an observational science, because it is historical science, it is extraordinarily dependent on place. You know, if you're a chemist, okay, when you do an experiment in the laboratory and then you come back 10 years later, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to get the same results. But we know as geologists that's not true. Geology is dependent on what happened before. What happened before influences what comes and follows it. It's contingent on time and location. So what do we do to understand geologic time? We make places in geologic time. We assign names: Proterozoic, Triassic, Eocene, Silurian, and so on. And then when we think about the Earth's history, we go to those places. We think, oh yes, the Cretaceous. Here's what the Earth looked like during the Cretaceous period. Here's where all the continents were. The oceans were high, at some point. And so we've made places, even though we've never been there ourselves, we've made places in time to understand deep time. And we also make places like today, right? We're in South America, and I come from North America. But if we went back 300 million years, we had Pangaea. And nobody's been to Pangaea, but it's a place, right? We recognized that this, starting with Alfred Wegener and some of the others, recognized that there was this giant supercontinent that formed, and we gave it a name. And so we have to make places in the past in order to understand geology. So place is really especially important to geology, I think. And that's partly why I got excited about it. Chuck Bailey, who was last year was the president of the Geological Society of America, he's from Virginia. And he gave an address at the end of his presidency. And he talked all about place. It was a wonderful talk. And here's one of the things he said. He said, geology sits at the confluence of time and place. And that, in many ways, this makes the geosciences unique. So he recognized this important relationship of place. Next slide, please. The question is, how do we connect to place in such a way that we can teach it and understand it and measure it? It's all well and good to say we are connected to place, but how can we make sense of that, right? As scientists, we want to be able to characterize that connection. We want to be able to measure that connection, and we want to be able to teach that connection. So we have this thing called the sense of place. We make intellectual and emotional connections to place. So right now, think for a moment about a place, doesn't matter where it is, that is important to you. Just, you can close your eyes, think about it just for a moment. Think about a place that is important to you. And then think about why it's important. Well, maybe it's because you do your research there. Maybe it's because when you were a child, you enjoyed playing there. You make intellectual connections. You say, yeah, this is a place where this particular fossil assemblage can be found and nowhere else. So you give it intellectual connections, but you also give it emotional connections. We are emotionally attached to meaningful places. We love them. We want to be in them. We want to make sacrifices sometimes to protect them. And when you combine the intellectual connections and the emotional connections that we make to places, that is what we call the sense of place. The sense of place is a set of meanings, intellectual meanings, and emotional attachments combined that we make to place. Next slide, please. And what's special about sense of place is that we can measure sense of place. Sense of place is defined in theory by geographers and psychologists, and we have ways of measuring it. We can measure it both quantitatively and qualitatively. Quantitatively, we can use surveys. We can ask people about their connection to place. We can give them a set of questions and say, how important is this place to you? Do you do what you want to do there? Does this place meet your needs? And you can rate them on a scale, what we call a Likert scale, from very negative to very positive. And if you give out enough of these surveys, you can do statistics on the responses, and you can actually get quantitative, statistically valid measurements of people's sense of place. So we can measure, we can use these surveys as a tool to measure sense of place. Next slide. But we can also qualitatively measure sense of place by just observing what people do. How do people act in an environment? Or what do they make drawings? Do they make reports? And also we can interview them. We can say, well, how do you feel about this place? Will you tell me about it? And I'll give you an example. Okay, I did a study with a PhD student some years ago where I taught a class where I was focusing on the Southwest of the United States, the geology of the Southwestern United States, and she was observing the class. And I would give this lecture, and every time I talked about a topic that was very specific to Arizona and the Southwest, the students were very attentive. But then when I would go off into more global things, I talk about ice caps, or I talk about the whole Earth and so on, they would be less attentive. They would pay less attention. So they were more fixed. They were more focused on that part of my talk that was related to the locals. So they had that strong sense of place for what was right around them. Okay, so we can do qualitative observations. This is what educators do all the time, right? Educators, when they assess teaching, they observe what the teacher does. They observe what the student does, and they can characterize those behaviors or those attitudes. Next slide, please. So sense of place is real. We can really measure it. And not only that, there is research that shows that sense of place correlates with pro-environmental and pro-social, positive attitudes and behaviors that support geoconservation. Right? We want to conserve these important landscapes. And if people have a strong sense of place for those landscapes, that helps. That helps us to conserve it. And so there are different measurements. Connections to place motivate teachers to teach and students to learn. If we teach in a way that connects to place, which we call place-based, which I'll introduce in a moment. Sense of place influences how we interpret national phenomena, and sense of place correlates with pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. These are all studies that were done where they measured sense of place and they looked at other behaviors, and they showed there was a statistically significant correlation between the two. And some of them are pretty recent. Some of this work has been done within the last 10 years, and so it's still going on. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the next point. What is place-based education, and how does it relate to place and sense of place? Next slide, please. So place-based education, that is a term that refers to a way of teaching and learning, a modality that is intentionally situated in a specific place or places. Teach about place-based about São Paulo, teach about São Paulo State, teach about Apiaí, teach about Phoenix, where I am, or Arizona. The place can be small or it can be large, but as long as it's focused in a particular place, that's part of it. The other thing is that we want to actually teach students to have better sense of place, stronger sense of place. I wouldn't say better, but stronger. We want sense of place to be a learning outcome of that teaching that we can actually measure, and we can show that, yes, because that student took that course, they have a stronger sense of place than they did before for that particular place. And I like to use quotes, okay? I like to use quotes other people. So the lower left is Greg Smith, who was one of the leading early scholars of place-based education. And here's how he described it. Place-based education is what happened before schools were created, right? Before we started putting people in rooms with walls around them. Where were they? They were outside, learning in the outdoors. Place-based education, that's what it was. Wisdom sits in places. That was an elder from the Apache tribe of the Southwest said that. And what he meant by that was that you go to places to learn from them. What you do in a place, what you experience in a place, there's knowledge encoded in that place that you can absorb and you can benefit from when you go to that place. That's what he's saying. Next slide, please. So the term place-based education is usually applied to formal education, okay, to education in a classroom, in a laboratory, during a field class. What we do here, okay, what you do here, what we do at our place, that's formal education. But you all know there's another whole world of informal education, also called free choice education, where people go to museums, people go to parks, people watch television, and they learn science that way too. That's called informal education or free choice education. And the term we use in that is called interpretation. Interpretation is how you teach in an informal realm. So what is interpretation? Well, that's kind of that picture came out kind of strange, but that's supposed to be Death Valley, the desert of Death Valley in California near southwestern United States. But interpretation aims to reveal meanings and relationships. And that's sense of place, right? Meanings is the intellect, relationships is the emotion. It's the same thing. Okay? Interpretation is a purposeful approach to communication that facilitates meaningful, relevant, and inclusive experiences. So the first quote is by Freeman Tilden, who is one of the early scholars of interpretation. The second is from the National Association for Interpretation, which is a professional society that supports interpretation. And what they're basically saying is interpretation is just another way to say place-based education. It's in a different realm, but it's the same idea. Next slide, please. So, in fact, the relationship between the two of them, you can see here, this is an inverted triangle that my good friend and colleague Robert Lilly from Oregon State University created. And what it shows is how scientific discoveries at the bottom apex of the triangle become meanings that everybody knows about. In fact, maybe if I go over here, it's easier to show that. So knowledge is produced by scientists, and then scientists share that knowledge with the rest of the world. And there are two pathways. This is the formal pathway. So scientists work at colleges and universities. They train teachers, and then teachers teach students in schools. But in the informal realm, scientists train interpreters like park rangers and museum curators, and they train people through parks and museums, and their realm is the public. And now with digital media and virtual reality, that's kind of in the middle because that kind of serves both worlds. And the reason why the triangle is inverted is because down here, only a few people know this knowledge, but that's widely held knowledge. So we want to disseminate knowledge to an increasingly larger group of people, and that's why the triangle expands. So there's two legs, but you can see they're very similar. They're very similar to each other. It's the same approach, just different audiences, basically. So next slide, please. Thanks. So now you know what place-based education and interpretation are. For most of the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about how we actually do it. Okay, I suspect that many, if not most of you, are already doing it, or you're learning in a place-based way, but maybe you've never thought about how we actually could explain it to somebody else. When I started talking about place-based education a long time ago, my teacher colleagues would say to me, well, how do you do it? How do you ensure that what you're teaching is place-based? And that's what I want to show you here. This is interesting. This is Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona. This is in northern Arizona, northern part of my state. It has one of the greatest assemblages of Triassic fossil wood anywhere on the planet. And the wood is not just fossil wood, it's beautiful fossil wood. It's agatized, so it's colorful and really, really lovely. And so it became a national park. And we led a field trip up there in 2019 during the Geological Society of America National Conference, and we made it accessible to people with disabilities. And that's important. When you're teaching in a place-based way, you don't want to exclude anybody. You want everybody to be able to do it. So you want to think about how accessibility is important. So that's why I showed that picture there. Next slide, please. So some years back, my colleagues and I came up with a 5-point model for how to teach in a place-based way. That's why I use the hand as a symbol. We have what we call 5 design elements, 5 different ways that we can teach in a place-based way. And if you do any one of these, then you can say you're teaching a place-based way. How did we come up with that model? We came up with it from a meta-analysis. We studied many, many different ways that people were teaching in place-based ways, and then we kind of concentrated it down to the 5 most common attributes of place-based education. And that's what are shown here. And that's what I say here. So the first one is that we draw our content, our subject matter, from the local and regional natural landscapes and phenomena. Those that are right here. Okay, what geology is here? What hydrology is here? What climate is here? That's what we want to focus on. But also we recognize that there's also a cultural landscape. There's cultural knowledge here. What did indigenous people think? What is the history of this place? What human events have happened here? That's the context, right? The content is geology, but the context is culture. It helps us to explain, and it also helps attract students to that place more when they're learning more about it. The third is to teach with authentic experiences. You want to get students into the environment as much as possible. The best way, of course, is to take them outside and take them to the locality. But if that's not possible, you can still bring specimens in. You can bring maps in. You could use colors. You can even use music and sound that is evocative of that place to help set the mood, if you will. And now with online education and virtual reality so important around the world now, we have the opportunity to do that in a virtual realm. We can give students virtual but still authentic experiences. The last two. The fourth one is that you want to teach in a way that promotes the sustainability of that place, the natural and cultural sustainability. Okay? And the fifth one is we want to encourage and guide learners to enrich their own senses of place. And that's what I mean is teaching sense of place. You want your students to gain more, even if they had a sense of place already, you want it to be stronger when they're done. And if they didn't have any, you want them to have it. Maybe they're from somewhere else, but they're here now, and now they're going to get a sense of place for here. So what I'd like to do now is go through those 5 design elements one by one and give you examples of how we can do this. And hopefully this will be something that you can say, well, yeah, I do this already. And that's great if you say that. Or you can say, I'm going to try this because I think it's interesting. I'd like to try it. So again, we've already said that in places that are important for the geoheritage, geology is important, but so is culture, this human history. That picture in the middle that shows a part of Grand Canyon, down in the Grand Canyon. And what it shows is there's this big stack of Paleozoic sedimentary rocks. The rocks at the bottom are early Cambrian. The rocks at the top are Permian. And they represent, from 508 to 270 million years ago of geologic history. All kinds of things happen. Orogenies, sea level rise, sea level fall, deposition on land, all these different changes. So there's a tremendous geologic heritage that's present in those rocks. On the right, what you see ancient granaries. These were grain storage facilities that were built by ancestral indigenous people about 1,200 years ago. They're not here anymore, but their legacy, their structures are there. And there are still indigenous people living there that still consider that to be their home, and they say, we're not using it right now, but we may use it again in the future. So they still consider it. It's not a ruin. We don't use that word ruin, okay? Because that implies it's lost and it's gone. And indigenous people never let go of these places. They're still important to them forever. So there's human heritage that's there. And then there's also ecologic heritage, right? We have ecosystems. We have the river flowing, the Colorado River down there. So all of these things are interwoven. We can't separate one from the other. So when we teach in a place-based way, we want to interweave the content, which we could say is the science, and the context, which is the culture. Now, if I were teaching, let's say I was teaching anthropology in a place-based way, then those two things would be reversed. The content would be the culture, and the context would be the nature. But either way, you want to use both, regardless of what you're doing. So on the right there, those are 2 signs. I was part of a wonderful project. It was really one of the best projects I ever had a chance to work on, where we created a place-based interpretive trail at Grand Canyon, which is called the Trail of Time. And the idea of the Trail of Time is that as you walk the trail, it's 1 meter for every 1,000,000 years. Right? So every meter you walk represents 1 more million years in the history of Grand Canyon. And then we put signs to recognize points like this is when Grand Canyon formed, this is when some rocks formed, and we also put the rocks. We got pieces of the rocks and so on. So people could teach themselves the history, the geologic history of Grand Canyon without a ranger, without a teacher. They could just read the signs and look at the rocks and walk the trail. But we also put, it's a little hard to read, the sign at the bottom says Grand Canyon is 6 million years old. That's one of the most important things that geologists can teach about Grand Canyon is the rocks in Grand Canyon go all the way back to 2 billion years. But the Grand Canyon itself is only 6 million years old. Young canyon, old rocks. That's what we like to say. So we try to point that out. But we also point out above there that people have lived in the Grand Canyon for at least 10 millennia, 10,000 years. So there's your culture, there's your nature, your geology, mixed together. We try to do that for the whole trail. Next slide, please. So here's the easy part. You're going to draw your content from local and natural landscape. This is the part that's easy for geologists and geographers and other natural scientists. You know the landscape intimately. You know the processes, you know the rocks, you know the fossils, you know what the landscape, you know the topography. And so you know what to teach. But here's a funny thing, and maybe it's not so true at this, but it is true at Arizona State where I am. Arizona is a geological wonderland. You know, we have just amazing things to do. We have Grand Canyon, we have the deserts. But most of my colleagues don't do their research in Arizona. They do their research on Mars. They do their research in Antarctica. Some come to Brazil, which I think is great. But they're not doing their work locally. I do my work locally, okay? But then I say to them, you're going to teach your students what you know. You're going to teach them about Mars. You're going to teach them about Antarctica. And that's great. They need to learn that. But they may graduate from our university and not know anything about Arizona. And I think that's terrible. If they're going to go to school as geologists in Arizona, they should study Arizona at least once, right? So that's what I try to pick. I pick, wherever I pick, I want it to be local. I want them to understand the local. And the students respond to that. They like it. Even the students that are doing their PhD work on Mars, they still like to take my class so that they know something about, maybe they're going to leave Arizona. After they get their PhD, they may go somewhere else. But they're going to care about Arizona, at least some, because they're going to take that class. So that's the one thing you got to be careful of is you can teach and you know your place really well, but you want to make sure that what you teach is actually of that place. And it doesn't have to be here. I mean, yeah, you could teach about in a place-based way about Sao Paulo. I have colleagues that teach place-based courses elsewhere. I have a colleague in New York who does research in Africa. So she teaches a place-based course on Africa. And that's okay because she knows that place and she gives the students some experience in Africa that way. So it doesn't have to be, it's nice to be local. You want to make sure your students understand the local, but you can go somewhere else as long as you're focusing on what that place is. That's the science. Next slide. I'm going to talk, and here's the trail of time. Here's an example so that it's a little hard to see, but the map on the right shows the trail as it goes around the south rim, the rim of the canyon. We don't go into the canyon, we go along the edge of the canyon, and that's so it could be accessible. If we tried to go down into the canyon, wheelchairs could not follow. So we put it along there. And you can see there's an example. We have people looking at signs, we have people looking at rock samples, and there's the stratigraphic, that's my wife and I. That's the stratigraphic column of Grand Canyon. That shows the entire stratigraphy of Grand Canyon to scale and made of the actual rocks. That's what we're really proud about. That is actually made of the real rocks from Grand Canyon. And we have 4 of those at each end of the trail and in the middle. So people, whenever they come onto the trail, they can see that. So we're not only using the science, we're actually using the real rocks from the natural landscape too, which we're very proud of doing that. Next slide. Has anybody been to Grand Canyon? Oh, come visit. Good. Okay, you've been. Did you walk the rim? Yeah. Oh, so maybe you saw our trail. It's been there since 2010. But okay. When we talk about place-based education, we have to consider the fact that almost every place we teach in was and maybe still is indigenous people's homeland. If we're going to be authentic and equitable about teaching culture, we have to make sure that indigenous presence is recognized. We have to acknowledge to our students that this is indigenous land. So how do we teach that if we ourselves are not indigenous? Okay. Now I had the very good fortune of working. I am not indigenous to North America, but I had the good fortune of spending most of my career working with people who are. and who have shared that knowledge with me and been very generous. And I even have family members. I have wife and children who are indigenous. So I've had that good fortune. It's really helped. And what they've taught me are these points here. If you're going to use indigenous knowledge, you have to be conscious when you're teaching in a place-based way, whose knowledge is being important, is being made important, who's being foregrounded or who's being centered. Is it your knowledge? Is it their knowledge? It doesn't mean one or the other is better, but you should be aware of what it is. Consult with the indigenous experts. Don't trust books. Books can be okay, but you want to get it from the actual sources, because throughout most of cultural history, authors have not always represented indigenous knowledge and history in the way that the indigenous people themselves know it to be. There can be errors, so you want to be careful of that. Learn about and interweave indigenous connections to land. Foreground indigenous toponymy, place names, okay? We have a lot of place names that were given by indigenous people that have been forgotten. Try to bring those back. That's what I try to do. The students appreciate that. Foreground indigenous perspectives of local environmental and land use issues. And if you have indigenous students, give them agency to share their knowledge if they want to. Don't force them. But if they want to share that knowledge, give them the opportunity to do that with your class. I do that. I have, Arizona State does have a lot of indigenous students. And when they're in my classes, I tell them, if you would like to share what you know, feel free to do that. We can have time in the class for that. And if I say something that's wrong, please correct me. Okay, I may make a mistake. Please tell me if I'm wrong. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is what's called the 7 R's of ethical research. These are 7 things you can do to make sure that you're doing things in the right way. You can show respect for knowledge and individuals. Don't think that your knowledge is the only thing, okay? Respect other knowledges, even if they're very different. Relevance. Make sure that what you teach is relevant to indigenous people. Reciprocity. The researcher must give back to people in their communities. Responsibility. You have to be acknowledged. You have to be responsible to the cultures and communities from whom you're taking the knowledge. Relatedness. Acknowledge the connectedness of all things in the Earth system. Relationships. Make sure that there's no such thing as bad subjectivity when you're working with indigenous people. They do not reject the idea of being connected to the object of study. That's the way it is. Subjectivity is not considered to be a bias in indigenous knowledge systems. So you want to respect that. And then redistribution. That means that when you learn something, you share it with the people. You don't just go into their culture and learn what you can and take the knowledge and run away and never come back again. That's what's called parachute or helicopter research. You parachute in, you get the knowledge, and you run out. That's bad. We don't want to do that. We want to share. We want to stay in contact with these communities and share the knowledge as much as we can. Next slide, please. That shows how much I'm talking right there. That's good. Okay, good. So I'm going to show you, we've done some work, and my colleague Angel here is going to talk about it too. We've done some work on how to do this interaction, this interweaving of indigenous knowledge and Western scientific knowledge in ways that follow those 7 R's, those ethically responsible guidelines. And there's several different models we use, which I can show you. And the first one is called two-eyed seeing. And we were doing this for a long time before we really knew what it was called. But in 2004, an indigenous elder kind of explained it, two-eyed seeing. Two-eyed seeing is that you see from one eye the strengths of indigenous knowledge. From the other eye, you see the strengths of Western knowledge. And you understand that they're both important, and then you find ways to sort of use those eyes together. So let me show an example of something we did. Again, I taught on the Navajo Nation for many years. My students were all indigenous, and I taught geology. And so what I was trying to do was teach geology in a way that was true to Western science, but also incorporated Navajo knowledge of geology in a way that was authentic. And here's one of the two-eyed seeing models. This is Monument Valley. This is a very famous erosional landscape, desert landscape in northern Arizona. It's on the Navajo Nation. And I was teaching about how landscapes evolved. And on the right here is a diagram that discusses process geomorphology, right? So what is process geomorphology? Process geomorphology is understanding of landscapes as being the product of 2 different opposing sets of processes, right? Internal processes and external processes, or endogenic processes and exogenic processes, or if you will, geodynamic processes and geomorphic processes, right? So here we have processes like, driven by plate tectonics, we have uplift, we have subsidence, we have structural geology going on, being driven by the Earth's own heat. Up here we have processes driven by solar energy and gravity. So we have the sedimentary process, we have weathering, erosion, transportation, deposition, biogenic processes, and these are interacting in the near surface environment to form landscapes in the critical zone, right, from the soil to the top of the trees, basically, the landscape. Well, it turns out that Navajo people, they understand the same thing, they just have a different way of saying it. They describe landscapes as being interactions between Mother Earth, which is called Nehostan, and Father Sky. So there's your internal and external processes. And they even have names. The processes that are associated with Father Sky are called Yakashba, and these would correspond to the geomorphic processes. The processes associated with Mother Earth are called Nikashba, internal processes. And the critical zone, they have a word for that too. It's Nihoka. That's the surface. So they can look at a summer thunderstorm, which is sending down heavy rain and eroding the landscape. You'll have flash flooding and you'll have erosion of the landscape. They see it in that term. They say Father Sky is sending down rain to erode the surface of Mother Earth. And that's good because that gives us soil and that gives us groundwater. So even though it's a momentarily destructive process, in the end, it's a positive process. So we can teach with both of those sets of knowledge, and we don't necessarily have to say that one is better than the other. They're both good, and you can understand the same thing from different perspectives. Next slide. Next slide is a shout out to Dr. Angel Garcia, where I'm going to brag and say he was my PhD student, and he's going to talk a lot more about this, so I'm not going to say much here, but this is from a paper we published in 2020. It's the same idea. It's two sets of knowledge, Western knowledge and indigenous knowledge. In this case, it's in Karsten Cave. I don't want to spoil your talk, so that's why I just want to say, but that's the same idea. It's also two-wide seeing. It's these two different knowledges put together. Next slide, please. I'll leave it to Angel to fill in the details. Here's another approach which I like. It's called a braided rivers approach. Braided rivers, they flow like this, right? They interweave. And that's what this idea is, that you have different streams of knowledge. Western knowledge, indigenous, maybe multiple indigenous knowledges. Like in Grand Canyon, we have 12 tribes. That means 12 different indigenous knowledges. And think of them as braided streams. They're moving from the source to the sink, and they're moving in their own paths, and each one has its own path, and that's good. But then there are places where they cross, right? And where they cross, that's opportunities for learning from both realms. So you look for the places where those streams of knowledge intersect, and you teach that. You say, well, here's a place that, like, in a way, it's kind of like two-wide seeing, but it's more sort of a global picture where you're looking at these different streams. So that's another approach, which I think is really good. Next slide, please. Since we're talking about geoheritage, a lot of geoheritage takes place in parks, public areas, public lands that have been set aside for the population. And again, we have to be very conscious when we create these parks that when we put names on the landscape, when we represent the landscape in maps or diagrams or oral presentations or written presentations, we want to be able to show, once again, the consilience, the connection of both the natural and cultural heritage. And here are a few examples from national parks that we have in the United States. In the upper left, that's Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. That's the island of Hawaii, which all of its active volcanoes. There's a wonderful national park there, and they created a museum where they talk about Hawaiian traditional knowledge of volcanoes. And they have a volcano goddess named Pele, and the stories of Pele explain a lot of really important basaltic volcanic phenomena. So they represent that at the museum. And I'm sad to say that museum is now gone because Pele took it back. Kilauea erupted and damaged the building. I'm hoping they're going to rebuild it somewhere else. And Hawaiians are very philosophic about that, by the way. When that happens, they say, well, Pele wanted it. There's nothing we can do. So they're not really. And then the other is the Grand Canyon. In the Grand Canyon, we have a place which is being established as an intertribal center, which has been turned over to the tribes and say, you can do anything you want to teach this knowledge. And that's a mural that was created. That mural was actually created by a Hopi artist many years ago, but it represents the Hopi perspective of the land. You see there's like 4 directions on there. That's very important to a lot of indigenous cultures, the idea that we look to the east, the south, the west, and the north for different kinds of knowledge. Knowledge becomes geographically encoded in many of these things because they don't have written language, right? If you don't have a written language, how are you going to pass the knowledge down from generation to generation? Well, oral is how you transmit it, but how do you store that knowledge? Well, they store that knowledge in the land. They look at landforms, and those landforms represent stories that they want to continue, so they teach about those. So the knowledge systems actually become encoded in the landscape, and they get passed down from generation to generation because the landforms are always there. The people are gone, but the landscape remains. So it's a permanent encoding of that knowledge. And then down at the right, a lot of place names in the national park system in the United States are insensitive culturally. They're names that were given primarily by white settlers, and they thought they were being fair by, using native names, but in many cases, they used the wrong names. Sometimes they use names that were actually curse words, okay, with it maybe not knowing it or not. But so the National Park Service is now making a concerted effort to rename places with the input of indigenous people so they can get it right. So there's a place in Grand Canyon where you see those trees there. It's a spring. It's a really lovely little oasis in a very dry area that for many years was called Indian Gardens. All right. Now that was a name that was imposed by white people. That was the traditional homeland of the Havasupai people, and they called it Ha'akyo. That was their name for it. So last year, 2 years ago, the National Park Service renamed Indian Garden. They call it Havasupai Gardens or Ha'akyo Havasupai Gardens, representing the Havasupai heritage of that land. And it was the Havasupai people that helped them do it. Next slide, please. So it isn't just, indigenous knowledge is really important, but when you're teaching in a place-based way, you want to think about all the other ways that people make sense of that place. And a lot of it has to do with art and humanities. Artists and humanists, they care about place just as much as scientists do. And they interact with that place, and they have their own sense of place, and it may be different from a scientist, but it provides wonderful context. So when I teach place-based writing, I ask students to read books from Southwestern-based poets and essayists. I say, how does this person understand the landscape, and what can we learn from what they say? I want them to listen to music. Every class that I teach on the Southwest Geology, I start the class with music. I turn on some music, and it's not just any old music. It's something I chose because it either relates to what we're going to talk about or it's by an artist from the Southwest. And I don't play, the geology campfire songs, the songs that geologists make up about, singing about rocks. I don't do that. I use music that was created by non-geologists, but is relevant to geology. And artists are wonderful. They represent the earth in all kinds of ways. They use local earth materials. That picture on the lower left there, that was a pendant necklace that one of my students created. Copper. It's made of copper beads and copper minerals because in Arizona, copper is very common, very predominant. We are one of the leading copper producers of the entire world, not just the United States. And so she created that beautiful necklace to represent the importance of copper in Arizona and how it occurred in different mineral forms. And I love that necklace so much, I bought it from her. So I'm the proud owner of that necklace, and I love it. That's a Navajo rug on the lower right. That's a traditional weaving from the indigenous Navajo people. And that's what's called a storm pattern rug. It's actually a representation of a desert thunderstorm graphically. You can see the zigzag lightning. You can see the clouds in different places. I'd have to take a while to interpret it for you, but that rug is essentially a artistic encoding of a thunderstorm. And if you understand how to read it, it tells you exactly what a thunderstorm is in the desert. And then, of course, pottery, right? We know about pottery. Pottery is made from clay. It's made from glazes, earth materials. In order to be a potter, you have to know your material. You usually know where it came from. And so it's also a really place-based way of teaching about the earth. Next slide, please. So I use music and writings and art in my teaching as well. Next, go ahead. Oh, you did good. Thanks. Authentic. The third point is authentic learning experiences. I just want to point here that whenever possible, you want to get them out into the environment. But you can use digital means. You can do digital works, and if you don't have physical access to a place, you can use virtual reality, and it still can be very powerful if you do it right. If you give them psychomotor experiences like we do in the Trail of Time, people walk. The thing about the Trail of Time is the history of the rocks at Grand Canyon is 2 billion years long. And on the Trail of Time, every step is 1 meter per million years. So you can do the math. Just to walk out the history of the rocks in the Grand Canyon, which is less than half the history of the Earth, it's 2 kilometers. Right? So by the time you get done with the Trail of Time, you can feel it in your legs. You just walk 2 kilometers and you say, every step I took was 1,000,000 years, but I had to take 2,000 steps to get to the age of the oldest rocks in the Grand Canyon. So that's really embodied learning, right? That's psychomotor experiences. Now, if you can't walk, you want to make sure that you have accessibility for people who have mobility disabilities. So you want to make it wheelchair accessible. You want to have options for people who can't see or who can't hear. So you want to think about accessibility when you do this. And you also want to think about whether the kind of inquiry you use is open inquiry, which means you just let them go and they explore and they find out what they can, or guided inquiry where you give them a set of questions or tasks which helps them make sense. And both ways are good. You just have to understand your student audience. Next slide, please. All right. And we have been working a great deal with virtual field trips, okay? Especially during COVID, right? When the COVID pandemic happened, we shut down the schools. People couldn't come to class. We went to digital teaching, online teaching. And that allowed us to really start working on making authentic ways of teaching in a place-based way, even in the digital realm. And we've done a lot of research at ASU, not only on how to create these virtual field trips, but also on how to study their impact. Do they really work? Do they really teach effectively? And we find ways to make these virtual field trips better. Next slide, please. Okay. One of the things we're really learning is that, traditionally, the teacher would create the virtual field trip, or somebody with a lot of money would go out and create this wonderful virtual field. And we're guilty of this, right? When we got started, we would start doing these virtual field trips where we would go out with cameras and recording instruments, and we'd go to these places like Grand Canyon or the canyons of Utah, and we'd create these trips, and it cost about 250,000 reais to create a single trip. Okay, that's not cheap. Right? You have to have grant money, so we would get grant money to do that. But what we can do now is cameras are so cheap. You can use your cell phone, right? You can use your cell phone camera, and you can make videos, and you can make illustrations. And there's software that allows you to take those images and to take those recordings and stitch them together to make quite effective virtual field experiences. And so what we're doing now is we're studying what are called student-produced virtual field experiences. Instead of creating a trip and giving it to your students, you take the students out and say, you make your own trip. What's important to you and what are you going to capture? And that's a powerful way of teaching in a place-based way where the students are responsible to go out and collect their own images and videos and measurements and then make their own trips and then share those trips with their fellow students. And some of those trips are so good that I use them in my own teaching afterwards. They do such a good job. But even if they're not that good, they're still learning when they do that. And they're still learning in a place-based way. Next slide, please. Another question is, well, if we're going to teach in a place-based way in a virtual environment, what is the virtual equivalent of the sense of place? Can you actually have a sense of place in a virtual environment? And I haven't done as much research on this, but a colleague of mine named Vipin Arora has. And what we find is that a lot of the ways that we teach in person in a place-based way have corresponding approaches in the virtual realm. We can teach sense of place in the virtual realm. There is such a thing as a virtual sense of place. We may have to go about it in a way that's somewhat different from when we teach in person, but we're still able. So this research is still being developed. We're not very far along yet. But early research does suggest that yes, even in the virtual environment, you can increase your students' sense of place, even if they don't actually ever go to that place. One of the really cool things we did, I had a PhD student, Angel knows him well, named Thomas Roberto. And for his master's degree, he compared an in-person field trip to Grand Canyon with a virtual field trip. So we took a bunch of, and I was the teacher for both. I took a bunch of students to the Grand Canyon and gave them a field trip. And then we had another group of students who took the virtual field trip to Grand Canyon. They didn't actually go to Grand Canyon. And what did we find? We found both groups learned really well. In fact, the virtual group, they had higher scores at the end than the in-person group. They learned better, actually. And what was really important, really exciting was we took the virtual field trip students. So we say, well, now that you've had the virtual field trip, you know Grand Canyon. It doesn't matter to you whether you go there or not. And they would say, no, When they took the virtual field trip, they were more interested in going to the real thing than before. So if you have students who are worried about the field, we all have students like that, right? They have worries about, well, where am I going to go to the bathroom? Where are the bañeros? Or where am I going to eat? You know, am I going to get along with the people in the bus or something? They worry about that, and that's called novelty space. That makes it harder to learn. Well, you can help by giving them a virtual field trip first. First, they go there virtually, and some of those concerns, they get worked out in advance. And they're better ready to go into the field for real after that. So we find that the two methods, they're not in opposition, they actually complement each other, they support each other. Next slide, please. So the fourth of these 5 ideas is that we want to teach in a way that fosters natural and cultural resilience and sustainability. And what I basically mean by that is that in a place-based way, you're giving students a lot of power, right? You're teaching them the details of that place. They get to understand that place really well, and they love that place. And that knowledge is power. You want to make sure that that knowledge is being used in the right ways. You don't want to teach them about a place for them to turn around and destroy it, right? You want them to learn about that place and then say, how can I protect it? How can I save it? How can I preserve it? Which, of course, are all objectives that are very, very compatible with geoconservation and geoheritage. So when you teach in a place-based way, you want the students to understand that there are disagreements about resource use. The upper part there, you may have heard about this, there are uranium deposits very close to Grand Canyon, just outside the boundary of the park. You cannot mine inside the park, but outside the park, you can if you get the right permission. But the tribes there, they don't like this at all. They see it as a desecration of their land. They see it, and there's a lot of potential. We know there's a lot of potential for groundwater contamination. Groundwater is very precious in the desert. So there are disputes over resources between indigenous people and corporations. And you don't necessarily want to pick sides, but you want to make sure that students understand both sides, right? You want to be fair. You want them to understand and they can make their own decisions. So you connect geoheritage to environmental and socioeconomic grand challenges, climate change, water resource depletion, land use disputes, mining. All these things are grand challenges. We have to do them in a more sustainable way. And geoheritage can contribute to that, and place-based education can contribute to how we actually do it. Next slide, please. We're almost to the end. So finally, the last of these 5 points is, how can we teach sense of place? All right. The number one way that I teach a sense of place is I want them to know that I love this place, okay? I can't wait to teach about, every fall when I teach my Arizona class, it's a highlight for me. I love to teach that class. I spend the whole rest of the year reading the newest papers that come out so I can be totally up to date, and then I can teach my students that. And so I get to spend my days thinking about Arizona, reading about Arizona, preparing to teach about Arizona, and then teaching about it. And I love Arizona, as you can maybe tell. And I want to teach my students that. I want to say, it's okay as a geologist to say that you love the earth. Because we all do, we just don't necessarily admit it. But I say you got to admit it. And you want people to care about the landscape. You want people to think about how they can defend it. You want students to go out into the field and say, I love this place too. I love this geology. And that emotional power motivates learning, okay? That supports learning. And you want students to care about it, so that's the emotional connections, even while you're teaching them the science, which is the intellectual connections. And together, those are sense of place. So that's how you teach sense of place. You embody it yourself in your teaching. I have a very strong sense of place, and I'm going to teach that to you. And I hope, and the thing is that Arizona State, like USP, is a big university. We have students from all over the world that come. Okay, and so they say, well, I'm only going to be here for 4 years. Why should I care about Arizona? And I have 2 reasons for that. One is I say, your degree is going to say Arizona State University on your diploma. So don't you think you should learn something about it while you're here? You're a geologist, right? You want to understand the geology. But the second reason is that if you understand this place, you can relate it to where you come from. Okay, for example, I have a lot of Arab students in my geology class. They come to ASU from the Middle East. great deserts in the Middle East. So I say, well, when we're going to teach you about the deserts of Arizona, maybe for a project, you can make a comparison between the deserts of your homeland and the deserts here. So you can make that connection. And so, we want to foster, we get people to do what we call service learning. We want them to go out to the community and teach the community. They can get academic credit for that. They can create works of art. They can become active in environmental organizations or other organizations. All of these things help to enrich their sense of place. And it's a positive attribute for place-based teaching. Next slide. So there we go. Those are the 5 things we can do. We teach local content. We use local context from culture. We teach with authentic experiences. We teach in a way that fosters sustainability and stewardship of the land. And we teach sense of place. And those 5 things are the most common characteristics of many people have done place-based education. I've studied it for years. Those 5 things are pretty much common to almost all of them. And so if you follow those 5 guidelines, then you're teaching in a place-based way. Next slide. So you say, well, I'd like to do that. I'd like to make changes, but it takes a long time, right? If you're teaching in one way and you want to make your teaching more place-based, it's going to take a lot of effort to change that. And I say yes, but it's important to recognize that place-based education is a continuum. You can teach in a way that's somewhat place-based all the way to a way that's completely place-based. And what you can start with is, in our textbooks, in our geology textbooks, we have these pictures of these locations that we use to illustrate Earth history or illustrate important geologic processes. What we can do is, we don't just identify them as a textbook example, we identify them as a place. We find out what their name is. Right, so that over there, some of you may recognize, that's been called Devil's Tower. That's an igneous intrusion that's been exposed in the state of Wyoming. It's a classic example of columnar jointed basalt and this landform. But the indigenous people call it Bear Lodge. And the reason why is they have a story that the columns, right, the columns that formed were caused by the claws of a bear, that people were up on top of that butte and the bear was trying to get them. That's the story there. So you can say that. You can say, well, this is an igneous intrusion, but here's the other story about it. And that's how you start. And then as you go along, you add more and more of the content, more and more of the culture. You become more familiar, more comfortable with how you teach it. You implement those 5 design elements. And at some point, you get to a point where the course isn't really geology anymore. The course is Brazil. And you're going to use geology, you're going to use geography, you're going to use history, you're going to use indigenous knowledge together to get to know that place better, for teachers. So it's a continuum, and you don't have to do it all at once. You can do it gradually. Because I've been doing this for a long time. I don't think I'm all the way to all 5 yet in any of the classes, but I'm pretty close. I'm probably like 4.5. Okay, so it's taken a while, but you can do it. It's a continuum. So just to summarize, geoheritage sites are places where geologic, natural, and cultural heritage all interweave and are conciliant. They work together, okay? Sense of place encapsulates people's connections to places. Place-based education and interpretation are ways that teach that are intentionally situated in a place, and we teach place as a learning outcome. And then these are the 5 design elements for how to do it. Next slide. Hope I haven't gone too far over, but... So I want to say, I hope I pronounce this right, muito obrigado. I want to thank very much USP and Geociencias and FAPES for the support, for bringing me here. I'm very grateful for that, and also to acknowledge the support I've gotten in the United States from the National Science Foundation and the Park Service. And I want to point out, some of you may be familiar with the IUGS book last year of the first 100. They picked the first top 100 geoheritage sites in the whole world. I believe there are at least 4 of them from Brazil in that book. But 2 of them are from Arizona, Grand Canyon and the Great Unconformity Zone. But thank you very much. Question? Oh, thank you. Obrigado. Are there questions, or you could probably ask them in Portuguese, and Professor Blattbashi will translate.
Oi, internet question. seems like you have a very strong identification with Arizona.
Yes.
So that's your presentation.
Yes.
That's very strong. Indeed. But when you come to a different place like Brazil, of course, if you have a student from Middle East, as you described before, I can tell, yes, we can make comparison between Arizona desert and the Middle East desert and landscapes. But when you come to a place like southern Brazil, or the place where I'm going tomorrow, like Ribeira Valley, which is very different landscape, very different in climate, very different culturally, what you are looking for?
Well, that's a great question. And what we also tend to learn is that if you have a strong sense of place for your own place, you tend to develop a pretty good sense of place for others too, or at least you can appreciate them. Okay? I think Arizona is really wonderful, and I love living there. But I have some students, they can't wait to leave. They get their degrees, I'm never going to come back. And the reason why is because there's somewhere else where they would rather be. And I can understand, like say, I understand you have a strong sense of place for somewhere else, just as I do for Arizona. So I can come to a place like Brazil, and I can see Brazilians that have that same love and connection to Brazil. And that's powerful. It's the same sort of thing. It can be used for teaching here. And it also, I think, supports the research we do, that it isn't so much the place that matters, it's our connection to the place that matters. So sense of place, everybody has, more or less. Some people don't have a strong sense of place. They travel a lot and they don't really care where they are. But most people I know, they have a strong sense of place for somewhere. And so that's what I look for when I come to a place like Brazil. And I feel very, because I have such a strong sense of place for my own home, when I come to a place like Brazil, I can appreciate the differences, and I can enjoy the differences. And I can say, wow, you have this in Brazil. We don't have this. I'm going to learn about this while I'm here. And it's, I've been to, to China and to South Africa and Peru, and it's the same thing. You appreciate what's in that place, I think. So I hope I answered your question.
Well, thank you for our presentation. Very, very nice presentation. You told us about some activities you made with local people,
Yes.
like interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to know much more about other kinds of activities you made with local people to find this kind of information.
Okay. I gave Denise a list of references, which I think she can share with you, where we have some papers published on some of the work we did. Okay, that might be a good place to start, because there's some things there, and I cite them in the slides, and you can go to it there, so you can read, and that'll give you some examples. But if there's something I'm sure Angel's going to have a lot to say about that also. We could, you can contact us anytime, and we can share it too. There are also communities. Now, I only know the ones in the United States, but there are communities in the United States that work with indigenous geosciences. They're professional societies and so on, and you can become a member of those societies, and then you can go to meetings and you can talk with people and learn from them also. And I'd be happy to share that list of those societies too. And even for Brazil, you could be a member of them. You don't have to be in the United States. So.
First, I'm sorry for my English.
It's better than my Portuguese.
So you talked about the subjectivity of this kind of survey.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that indigenous people, sometimes the knowledge that you get from how they see and how they relate to the place is kind of hard to translate to the scientific way.
Western science, yes.
So I'm wondering, how can you construct this bridge between what you learn with the indigenous people and how you translate that to the scientific community?
That's a great question. And I think the most important thing is that there's a history in Western science that discounts any form of knowledge that is not Western science. It's either Western science or it's not valuable. Okay? That attitude has to go away. Okay, we don't know enough. I mean, we make a judgment based on insufficient data, which is not scientific. If you say your way of knowing is not right, Well, but you don't know it well enough to be able to say that, okay? And we may never know it well enough, okay? I've been working with indigenous people for 4 decades, but I still don't know that much because I did not grow up in that tradition. So what I say is, I may not understand what you're doing and I may not be able to teach it accurately, but I am going to respect it. And I'm going to not challenge its validity. And that's what the two-eyed seeing idea is, that you can teach both and you can allow the students to learn both without making any value judgments about which one is right or which one is wrong. And so that's what we try to do, is that we try to present both, and we say you can learn both and you can understand them and you can make of them what you will. And the indigenous students really appreciate that because now their knowledge is not being suppressed. So that's how we do it. I mean, yeah, I completely understand that there are some things in indigenous knowledge that Western scientists would just disagree with. They say, well, I don't think this is, and that's fine. As long as you present them both and you say they're both, we're not going to say which is better. We're just going to give you both. And you want to be accurate. You want to do the Western science as accurately as you can, and you want to do the traditional knowledge as accurately as you can. You don't want to misrepresent either one of them, but you present them side by side and without value judgments. You know, if nothing else, that enriches the student's sense of place because they're learning something about the place that they would not have learned in any other context. And they may not choose to use it, they may not choose to believe it, but at least they understand that it exists.
We have some questions from the YouTube.
Okay.
And Maxwell Pontes is telling that our basic curriculum is there's some possibilities to work with place-based education.
Oh, good.
But he's telling that the problem is the teaching information.
Yes.
You would like to know about the US. How do you work with teaching information?
Again, the references are a good place to start. It's important to know that if you're going to work with indigenous communities, you have to create trust, and you can't rush it. It's a slow process. As I said, it was 15 years for me. It was at least 10 years of those 15 years before I really felt comfortable. So you have to invest time. And if you don't have the time, you have to find collaborators who do, or who have the time to help you.
And about the teaching information.
Oh, you mean the teaching methods?
Yes.
Oh, there's some wonderful papers on placement.
Okay.
In that list of references, there are several really good papers on placement. We wrote a couple, but others did too, on how to teach place-based way. And there are books. There are books out there. I know most of the ones I know are written in English, but there may be some Brazilian books. I don't know. It would be wonderful.
Karina Ibanez, thank you for presentation. A very relevant topic for geoconservation, geosciences as a whole. And then she's asking, do you have any insight into how indigenous people in the region view geological scientific significance?
Yes. Meaning in which region? Any region, like
yes.
Raya? Oh, sure. I mean, we at least in the people I've worked with, and Angel also has done this, and he'll talk about it, I'm sure. If you spend enough time and you ask the right questions, you can actually learn, how do you see these rocks? How do you see these processes? How do you see time? Okay, I mean, like working with the Navajo people, I found that they do not discount the idea of deep time. They just never really concern themselves with how much. They say, we have been here for this amount of time, and the landscape has been here longer, and they accept that. They never really think about how much longer because it's not directly relevant to their lives. But that sort of predisposes them, if they want to start thinking about geology, that they can start thinking, oh yeah, how long is that exactly? So.
And there's another question. What is your view of the importance of geologists working in this area of knowledge, which is still little known and addressed among the geoscientific community in Brazil?
Are you talking about
Yeah.
geoscience education or geoheritage?
Geoheritage.
Okay, well, I think that's you're right. It's not as well known. I mean, we're the choir, right? We're speaking to people who know it very well and appreciate it. There's a lot of opportunity, and I would say if you're a scholarly geologist, there's a lot of opportunity for publications and grants and so on. There's a lot of good research out there to do. But even if not, it's an opportunity. If you're a geologist, you can volunteer, right? You have knowledge of a place, you can share that knowledge with the public. You know, even if you're not paid, or you can be a volunteer. I do that. I go to state parks in Arizona and I teach people geology as a volunteer.
Okay, mais alguma?
I've probably taken more time than I was supposed
No,
to.
it's okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.